Odette Pierce viewed the new house through the tinted glass of the car. The two-story Georgian-style mansion towered over the manicured lawn, surrounded by young maples. Broken Arrow greeted the Pierce family with July heat and sticky, humid air that reminded them they were still in the South, even though they had left their native Texas. Bentley chose this house without her input, nor, for that matter, had he made the decision to relocate on his own after the successful acquisition of a new oil refinery company in Oklahoma. "You realize, darling, this is a great opportunity to expand the business." His words sounded like a statement of fact that didn't require discussion. The mansion was more spacious than their previous home in Houston. Odette wandered through the rooms, absent-mindedly tapping her fingers against the freshly painted walls. An army of designers and decorators had already finished the job, arranging antique furniture and hanging pictures, transforming the empty space into another perfect home for the perfect family. In her 32, Odette fully met the unspoken standards of an oil magnate's wife: impeccable appearance, charity work, membership in elite clubs. Her beauty was that calm, refined beauty which does not cause envy, but invariably attracts admiring glances. The first month at Broken Arrow went by in the usual routine of social events. Bentley insisted on integrating quickly into local society. "Connections make all the difference, my dear," he liked to say as he adjusted the knot of his tie before the next reception. Odette smiled dutifully, met other businessmen's wives for lunch, and joined several charitable committees. In early August, Mrs. Henderson, the wife of Bentley's partner, invited them to a fundraiser at a local church. "Reverend Blackwood is a real treasure to our town," she chirped over the phone. "So educated, such a modern approach to ministry. You should definitely get to know him." Holy Redeemer Church was located in the historic downtown, a stately red brick building with stained glass windows and a tall bell tower. The evening was a fundraiser for the new community center. Odette recognized almost everyone among the guests. In a month, she had already settled into the tight circle of the local elite. Reverend Blackwood appeared near the end of the formal part. Tall, with straight features and attentive brown eyes, he really didn't look like a typical church minister. There was none of the usual religious pathos in his speech about society's responsibility to the needy, only sincere conviction and quiet charisma. Bentley nodded approvingly as he listened to the Reverend. "These are the kind of connections we need," he said softly, leaning toward Odette. "I'll double our usual donation." She remained silent as she watched Torrin Blackwood interact with the guests, attentive and interested, but without a hint of the ingratiation she was used to seeing in people around her husband. Later, when Bentley had stepped away to discuss some business matters, Reverend Blackwood unexpectedly joins Odette at the refreshment table. "How do you like our little town, Mrs. Pierce?" There was a slight irony in his voice, as if he knew exactly how she felt about moving from the metropolis to the country. For the first time all evening, Odette smiled genuinely. "He's different, but maybe that's exactly what I need right now." At home, lying sleepless on her side of their huge marital bed, Odette thought about how accurately Reverend Blackwood had picked up on her condition. Bentley was habitually working late into the night in the downstairs study. She could hear his muffled voice discussing some figures and transactions over the phone. 13 years of marriage had taught her not to wait for him, not to try to share an evening or dinner with him. She'd learned to live in this gilded cage where everything was perfect except for the emptiness inside. By the end of September, the heat had abated, and Odette began attending morning services at Holy Redeemer Church. At first, it was just a way to fill the empty hours. Bentley was often away on business trips, leaving her alone with an impeccably organized household. The house shone clean thanks to the efforts of the maid. The gardener kept the garden in perfect order, and the personal chef made sure the fridge was always full of healthy food that Odette barely touched. Reverend Blackwood led a Bible study on Wednesdays. After several visits, Odette noted that his interpretations of the sacred texts were quite different from what she had heard before. He spoke of compassion and understanding, avoiding categorical judgments. Gradually, she began to stay late after class to discuss the topics that had been raised. Their conversations became more and more personal. Torrin told of his journey to ministry through doubts and disappointments, of his years in seminary where he studied not only theology, but also psychology. Odette shared the story of her marriage, how she met Bentley at a fundraiser hosted by her parents, how things quickly worked out, and how she gradually dissolved into the role of the perfect wife. In early October, Odette began helping to organize the church's charity soup kitchen. She spent several hours there each day, distributing food to the needy. Torrin often joined her and they worked side by side, exchanging glances and occasional touches that became less and less casual. Bentley seemed to approve of her new passion for charity. "It's good for my reputation," he remarked one night at dinner, looking at the local paper with an article about the dining room operation. Odette remained silent, feeling a muffled irritation growing inside at his words. Their first kiss had happened in the church library late one evening as they sorted through donated books. Torrin reached for a volume on the top shelf and his hand casually touched her shoulder. Odette froze, feeling his breath on her cheek. The moment stretched into eternity before their lips met. After that, their meetings became secret and hurried. Short touches in an empty church hallway, stolen kisses in Thorin's study, long conversations in a park on the other side of town where no one knew them. Odette felt both guilty and incredibly alive at the same time. Bentley was staying late at work more and more often, immersed in some important project. His authority was now manifested in the smallest of things. He insisted that Odette report every move she made, installed a location tracking app on her phone for security, demanded immediate responses to messages. In mid-November, Odette felt the first signs of malaise. At first she wrote it off as stress, but a week later she bought a pregnancy test. When she saw 2 stripes, she sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, trying to realize what had happened. Bentley couldn't be the father. They had barely shared the marital bed for the past 6 months. Torrin had not reacted to the news in the way she had expected. Fear mixed with panic flashed in his eyes. "I need time to think," he said, nervously adjusting his collar. "This is all very complicated, Odette. My reputation, my flock." His voice shook, and for the first time she saw his confident image crumble. In the days that followed, Odette began to notice strange details. A black SUV that seemed to randomly appear nearby whenever she left the house. Unfamiliar numbers on her missed calls list. The feeling of someone else's gaze following her everywhere she went. One morning, she found someone rummaging through the glove compartment of her car. Everything was lying almost the same as usual, but she remembered exactly how the papers were stacked in a different order. That afternoon, Bentley had been particularly persistent in asking about her plans for the week, about new acquaintances at church, about topics being discussed at Bible study circle. Torrin avoided being alone with her, canceling several private meetings under the pretext of urgent business. In the rare moments when they did manage to talk, he seemed distracted and anxious. "I think we're being watched," Odette whispered during a brief conversation in the church garden. Torrin turned pale and hurried away, muttering something about urgent business. December began with lingering rains. Odette spent long hours at the window, watching the drops drip down the glass. She felt nauseous in the mornings, but Bentley didn't notice anything unusual, completely immersed in his mysterious project, or pretended not to notice. Sometimes she thought she caught something new in his gaze, a cold, calculating observation that sent chills down her spine. The first snow fell on Christmas Eve. Broken Arrow was transformed, covered with a white blanket that hid the grayness of December. The garlands on the facades of the houses cast multicolored reflections on the fresh snow, creating an almost open-air picture of a festive city. Odette was standing at the window when her phone vibrated, a message from Torrin requesting an urgent meeting at his office at the church. It was unexpected. He had studiously avoided face-to-face meetings for the past few weeks, limiting himself to formal socializing during services. The churchyard greeted her with the crunch of fresh snow underfoot and silence, broken only by the distant ringing of the bells of the neighboring parish. The old wing of the church, where the reverend's office was located, had been built back in the late 19th century. Odette often thought that those walls had seen many secrets and sins in their long history. The massive oak door of the study gave way with a distinctive creak. Torrin turned quickly at the sound, and Odette noted how gaunt his face had become in the last few days. There were deep shadows under his eyes, his cheeks sunken, and his once impeccably styled hair was in disarray. He paced the room nervously, every now and then adjusting his tie with shaking hands. The office looked different than usual. Papers were scattered everywhere. Several desk drawers were pulled out, and crumpled sheets were lying on the floor. The stained glass windows let in enough light that Odette could see the signs of recent crying on the face of the man she'd trusted not only with her heart, but with her soul. "I need money, Odette, a substantial amount." His voice sounded hoarse, as if each word scratched his throat. "I should have told you sooner. It all started 3 years ago. I decided to invest church money in a promising startup. They promised to triple the investment in a year. I thought it would help expand the church's orphanage, repair the roof." He paused, sinking heavily into his chair. "Things went well at first. The first payments came in on time. I invested some more, then some more. Then it turned out the company was a pyramid scheme. I tried to save something, took out loans, remortgaged my house. Now the debt collectors are threatening to reveal everything to the board of trustees." Torin raised reddened eyes to Odette. "I have debts that no one can know about. If the information leaks out, I'll lose everything. The church, the flock, my reputation." Odette listened to his rambling story, feeling a cold emptiness growing inside. The man before her seemed but a pale shadow of the charismatic preacher who had won her heart months ago. One thought pulsed in her mind. How could he have fallen so low? $50,000. Torin pronounced the amount as if it burned his tongue. "You have access to your husband's accounts. That's chump change for you, Odette. He won't even notice." When she shook her head slowly, his face contorted into a mask of despair and anger. "Then I'll have to tell Bentley about the baby. Do you think he'll be interested in why his wife is pregnant, considering they haven't shared a bed in months?" Stepping out of the church into the freezing air, Odette couldn't take the shiver away for a long time. She drove several blocks before she could breathe normally. Just then, a familiar figure in the mall parking lot caught her attention. Bentley, her impecunious husband, was standing by his Range Rover, but he looked unfamiliar, wearing a worn jacket and a baseball cap pulled over his eyes. Odette slowed down, watching as a stranger in a dark coat approached him. They exchanged a few words, after which the stranger handed Bentley a small package. The entire encounter took no more than a minute. At home, looking through her bank statements, a habit developed through years of marriage, she discovered a strange transaction. $50,000 had been transferred to the account of a company with a hard-to-pronounce name. Odette checked all the files in her husband's office, but found no mention of the firm in the business records. Sunday service on the last Sunday before Christmas always drew a full congregation. Thorin showed up at the church a few minutes before it began, pale but collected. His sermon sounded particularly poignant. He spoke of forgiveness and redemption, the weight of sins, and the lightness of grace. Standing in the last row, Odette could feel the heavy gaze of her husband sitting a few rows in front of her. After the service, only the most faithful of the congregation remained in the church, those who always stayed late for communion. Thorin, following his invariable Sunday ritual, secluded himself in the study to prepare. He always personally poured the wine, considering it an important part of the sacrament. A bottle of dark church wine was already waiting for him on the table. Mrs. Harris, the church housekeeper, knocked on the office door an hour later with a folder of documents requiring his signature. Receiving no answer, she cautiously opened the door. Sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted the room in whimsical colors. Reverend Blackwood sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair. An unfinished glass of wine stood beside him. He had a look of surprise on his face, as if death had caught him in the middle of some important thought. The housekeeper's cry echoed through the empty corridors of the church. Within minutes, the news spread through the town, gathering a crowd of anxious parishioners at the church gate. Some cried, some demanded explanations. Elderly women prayed, kneeling in the snow. Police officers quickly cordoned off the area, stretching yellow tape. When Odette informed her husband of what had happened, Bentley didn't even look away from his laptop. "What a tragedy," he said in a flat voice. "Funds will have to be set aside to organize a decent funeral." At that moment, for the first time in 13 years of marriage, Odette felt not just fear of her husband, but real animal terror. The phone call came late in the afternoon. "Mrs. Pierce? Detective Vale. We need to talk about Reverend Blackwood. The pause in the receiver seemed interminable. Preliminary forensics showed traces of poison in his system. I'm afraid we're talking about murder. Until well into the night, Odette sat in her bedroom listening to the sounds of the house. Downstairs, Bentley was having some sort of phone conversation. His voice sounded muffled but confident. At some point, scraps of phrases seeped through the floorboards. All done clean. No marks. She froze, trying to convince herself that it was just a play of imagination, born of fear and guilt. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a white shroud. Somewhere in the distance, the Christmas bells were ringing, but now their sound seemed ominous, like a funeral bell tolling for all that had once been dear and sacred. Odette didn't sleep a wink that night, realizing that her life would never be the same again. Detectives Hawkins Vale and Astrid Kane arrived in Broken Arrow the day after Reverend Blackwood's death. Toxicology tests had found a significant concentration of cyanide in the victim's blood, instantly moving the case from accident to murder. Vale, a massive man with graying hair and attentive gray eyes, had specialized in homicide investigations for the past 15 years. His partner, Astrid Kane, had joined the department only 3 years ago, but had already earned a reputation as a meticulous analyst with a special knack for financial fraud. The first thing they did was interview the church staff. The housekeeper, an elderly Mrs. Harris, described the Reverend's strange behavior in recent weeks. He became jumpy, often locked himself in the study, and those long conversations with Mrs. Pierce. She pursed her lips meaningfully at the last words. Odette was called in for questioning the day after the funeral. She looked out of place in the small office at the police station in her expensive suit and pearl earrings. Detective Kane noticed her pallor and the slight tremor in her hands. "How long have you known Reverend Blackwood?" The questions poured in one after another, about charity work, about personal encounters, about the topics of their conversations. Odette answered cautiously, weighing each word. Yes, she helped out at the church. No, there was no special relationship with the Reverend, just the usual parishioner-priest interaction. The same day, the search turned up Thorin's diary. A small black notebook was hidden in the double bottom of a desk drawer. The detectives spent several hours parsing the Reverend's hurried handwriting. The entries of the last few months were full of anxiety and hints of some kind of threat from a powerful man. The finance department had discovered a series of suspicious transactions. A large sum was transferred through a shell company a few days before the murder. Astrid Kane spent 3 days unraveling a complex money transfer scheme. The trail led to an offshore company registered in the Cayman Islands. The breakthrough in the investigation came thanks to Vale's old informant. A man known in certain circles as Rat had set up a meeting at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. "I heard someone was looking for some special merchandise," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Chemicals, specific ones, the kind that leave no trace." A lab analysis of the wine bottle yielded another surprise. Microparticles of an unusual metal alloy were found on the neck. A forensic expert spent 3 days trying to determine its composition. "This alloy is only used in industrial production," he explained to the detectives, "and on very specific equipment." Gradually, a picture began to emerge. Detective Kane checked all the local businesses that used similar alloys. The list was short, just 3 plants, all owned by Bentley Pierce. Odette was called back in for a second interview. This time, Detective Vale was unaccustomedly soft. "Mrs. Pierce, we're aware of your situation," he began after formal greetings, "and that Reverend Blackwood has begun blackmailing you." Odette turned even paler, but her voice remained firm. "You don't understand. It's much more complicated than that." That evening, the detectives sat late into the night, working on the case files. "Look," Astrid spread the financial documents on the table. "Pierce wired the money through a shell company. 2 days later, one James Morrison withdraws the exact same amount in cash. And a week later, the Reverend is dead. And we have security footage," Vale added, reviewing the video on his computer. "A car that looks like Pierce's Range Rover outside the church the night before the murder. Can't make out the license plates, but the model and color match." The investigation progressed slowly but steadily. Each new piece of evidence fell into place like a piece of a mosaic, forming an increasingly clear picture of the crime. The detectives realized that they were dealing with a man of intelligence and influence who carefully planned his every move. Astrid Kane was particularly interested in the fact that Bentley Pierce had a degree in chemistry from his youth before he went into the oil business. "He knew what he was doing," she remarked, looking up his biography. "Cyanide is not a random choice. It's the decision of a man who understands chemical processes." January was unusually cold. Detective Vale warmed his hands on a paper cup of coffee as he reviewed the forensic results. The lab had confirmed. The metal particles on the poison bottle were identical to the alloy used in the production lines of Pierce's plants. "He made a mistake." Astrid Kane tapped her pen on the documents. "Decided to do it all himself, didn't trust anyone. Replaced a bottle of wine personally, so he left a trail." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Another witness was brought in. The informant, nicknamed Rat, was nervously rubbing the sleeve of his tattered jacket. "I told you, I don't want to be seen," he muttered, looking around. "These people, they're serious guys." "Tell us about the order." Vale motioned the coffee cup toward him. "Who was looking for the chemicals?" "I didn't see him." Rat took a sip and grumbled. "It was all going through a middleman. But the money was serious. 50 grand for simple cyanide is overkill. Usually this kind of stuff goes for a lot less." "The middleman was James Morrison?" Astrid placed a photograph on the table. "Yeah, that's him. Slippery type. Only works with rich clients. They say he's got connections in the chemical industry." In the office next door, Odette Pierce sat motionless, staring at one point. Over the past month, she had visibly slimmed down, shadows lingering under her eyes. 4 months pregnant, her condition was alarming to the doctors. "Mrs. Pierce," Detective Vale said softly but insistently, "we know about the affair with Reverend Blackwood. We have his diary, witness statements. What's important now is to hear your side of the story." Odette looked up slowly. "You don't understand. Bentley, he's in control. Always has been in control. Every move I make, every breath I take." Her hands involuntarily rested on her stomach. "When Torrin started blackmailing me, I thought it was the end. But Bentley, he already knew. He always knows everything." "Tell me about your husband." Astrid took a seat next to Odette. "About his behavior in recent months." "He's changed since the move. Became more withdrawn, often locked himself in his study. Sometimes I'd hear his phone conversations. He'd discuss some chemical formulas, purification processes." Odette paused. "You know, he's a chemist by first education. Always prided himself on that, though he went into business a long time ago." That same afternoon, detectives obtained a search warrant for the Pierce home. Bentley greeted them with the impeccable courtesy of a successful businessman. "Sure, come on in. My house is open to members of the law." His office proved to be a model of pedantic order, every document organized in folders, every item in its place. On the wall were diplomas from prestigious universities, among them a degree in chemistry, earned with honors. "Mr. Pierce," Vale placed the surveillance photos on the table. "Is this your car outside the church the evening before Reverend Blackwood died?" "Maybe," Bentley shrugged. "I'm often in that part of town. I have several business associates there. And this," Astrid laid out the forensic results, "is an analysis of the metal particles from the bottle that contained the poison. This kind of alloy is only used in your factories." For the first time in the entire conversation, concern flashed in Bentley's eyes, but he quickly pulled himself together. "You do realize this proves nothing, don't you? My factories produce thousands of tons of product." "And this?" Vale pulled out printouts of bank transfers. $50,000 through a shell company, the exact same amount withdrawn by James Morrison, a man known for his connections to chemical dealers. "I'm a businessman." Bentley's voice remained calm. "I conduct dozens of transactions every day." "Your wife is pregnant," Astrid said suddenly. "But not by you. And you knew it. Knew about her affair with the Reverend, followed her, gathered information, and then methodically planned the murder. Have you heard of the principle of presumption of innocence, Detective?" Bentley smiled. "It's all circumstantial evidence and speculation. And this?" Vale laid the last document on the table. James Morrison's statement. He agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Very detailed about meeting you, the cyanide order, even the method of payment. The smile slowly slid off Bentley's face. He was silent for almost a minute, looking at the papers on the desk. When he spoke, his voice sounded completely different, cold and hard. "You think I could let this imposter in a cassock destroy everything I've built? My reputation, my business, my standing in the community, all depend on an impeccable image, and this..." He paused, clenching his fists. "She was the perfect wife. I gave her everything, and she, with that preacher." The detectives read him his rights and handcuffed him. As they led him out of the house, Odette stood at the second-floor window. Their gazes met for a moment, and she saw in his eyes the same cold rage that had haunted her all 13 years of their marriage. The trial of Bentley Pierce lasted 3 months and was the most high-profile trial in the history of Broken Arrow. The state's attorney personally supported the prosecution, presenting the jury with overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt. James Morrison's testimony, surveillance footage, financial records, and forensic analysis formed an impeccable chain of evidence. But it was Odette's appearance in the courtroom that made the difference. 5 months pregnant, she held herself with remarkable dignity. Her testimony about years of psychological control, total surveillance, and manipulation impressed the jury. As she described how Bentley spent years building a golden cage around her, many in the audience couldn't hold back tears. Bentley remained silent throughout the trial. It wasn't until the last word that he finally spoke. "I created the perfect life. Everything had to be flawless. I couldn't let some preacher ruin it." There was no remorse or regret in his voice, only the cold conviction that he was right. The jury deliberated for less than 24 hours. Bentley Pierce was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Additionally, the court ordered him to pay large restitution to the church and the family of Torrin Blackwood. In August, Odette gave birth to a baby girl. The baby was named Grace, in memory of the grace that her father so often mentioned in his sermons. After being discharged from the hospital, Odette did not return to Broken Arrow. She bought a small house in the suburbs of San Diego and began life with a clean slate, reclaiming her maiden name. She divided the money from the sale of her share of the Bentley business, a substantial sum even after all legal fees, into 3 parts. The first she invested in an educational fund for her daughter. The second went into a trust fund to help victims of domestic violence. She used the third to start a psychological support center for women in emotional and psychological control. Detectives Vale and Kane received promotions, but often remembered the case as a turning point in their careers. "You know what the scariest part is?" Astrid said over a cup of coffee. "How easily we believe the facade, the respectable businessman, the model family man, the philanthropist, and behind that mask, a monster capable of planning a murder in cold blood." The Church of the Holy Redeemer was not empty. A new preacher, a young and energetic pastor, Simon Grant, brought a fresh lease of life to the parish. But every Christmas, the parishioners lit a candle in memory of Reverend Blackwood, whose sincere faith and humanity left a deep mark on their hearts. A year later, Odette wrote a book, not about a murder or a high-profile trial, but about the importance of hearing your inner voice and not letting others control your life. The book became a bestseller and helped many women find the strength to change their destiny. Little Grace grew up a bright and cheerful child, inheriting her mother's beauty and her father's insightful mind and love of books. Odette never hid the truth of her origins from her daughter, but neither did she let the tragedy of the past cloud their present. In Oklahoma business circles, Bentley Pierce's name was gradually forgotten. His companies were sold or reorganized, his connections dissolved, his influence waned. In his prison cell, he spent his time reading books on chemistry, the only hobby that remained unchanged from his youth. And Broken Arrow went on with his life, keeping this story in his memory as a reminder that a respectable facade can hide an abyss, and that in the darkest moments of life, one must look for the light within.